In an alternative reality, humans and dinosaurs coexist peacefully in the Stone Age. They even work together in everyday activities, as is the case with the workers of the famous Slate Rock and Gravel Company. However, the company's vice president, called Cliff, plans to take all the company's money, together with his assistant, Sharon. But in order to do this, he needs an employee who is naive enough not to suspect his plan, and one of them is Fred Flintstone. Meanwhile, as the workday draws to a close, Fred shouts for joy and drives home in his stone car. He lives in the town of Bedrock and, when evening comes, he takes his whole family to the movies. The next day, Fred is driving home from another day's work with Barney, his best friend. Barney is delighted because, thanks to Fred's help, he and his wife, Betty, will be able to adopt a child. However, this was only possible after Fred gave Barney a large sum of money. For this reason, he asks his friend not to tell anyone about it, especially Wilma, his wife. A few minutes later, Fred returns home and is greeted by Dino, who jumps on top of his owner and fondles him. After talking to his wife and daughter, Mr. Flintstone sits down in the armchair to rest, but Wilma soon warns him that the sink disposer is faulty. What's more, she couldn't buy a new one because the money had been taken from her savings account. Wilma demands an explanation from her husband and Fred confesses that he gave the money so that Barney could carry out the adoption. Fred expects his wife to scold him, but instead she is moved by her husband's noble attitude. Later, the Flintstones go to the adoption center to accompany Barney and Betty on their first contact with their new son. The assistant finally brings the baby, but instead of a human child, the woman brings a monkey baby. Barney and Betty are confused, but fortunately, the baby was from another family of monkeys, who were waiting on site. Finally, the assistant introduces the couple to their new son Bam Bam, a boy raised by mastodons and with enormous physical strength. Barney tries to talk to him and Wilma wants to take a photo of the moment, but Bam Bam is frightened by the flash of the camera and runs out of the window. The boy runs off down the street, causing the biggest fuss, until Barney and Fred finally manage to catch him. Now, a new life begins for the Rubble family, with Barney and Betty doing their best to raise the boy. Despite not yet being able to speak in his enormous strength, Bam Bam gradually becomes more affectionate and begins to treat the couple like his real parents. When night falls, it's time for Barney to get out of the house and enjoy his favorite pastime, bowling. He and Fred are on the same team and, in order to beat their opponents, they need to hit a perfect strike. Fred is the next to play and, full of self-confidence, he throws the ball and hits a strike, consecrating his team as the winners. For their victory, the team gets a huge glass of booze, but before they drink it all, Barney takes the opportunity to pay tribute to Fred. He recites a poem he wrote, thanking him for having the best friend in the world, which makes Fred very emotional. Hours later, Fred returns home and quietly tries to get inside, but accidentally ends up slipping on a toy car. The noise soon attracts the attention of his wife, and what's worse, his mother-in-law, who had come to visit. The old woman doesn't hide her disgust at her daughter marrying Fred, whom she considers a nobody. However, this only makes Flintstone even more motivated and he promises that one day he will prove his worth to everyone in Bedrock. Another day passes and it's lunchtime at the Slate Rock and Gravel Company. Suddenly, Vice President Cliff introduces everyone to the company's new project, in which there will be a selection process to promote one of the employees to the position of executive. This is Fred's chance to become someone important, so he starts studying day and night before the exam. Finally, the day of the selection arrives and Cliff hands out aptitude tests to the employees, who will only have an hour to answer all the questions. However, the test proves to be very difficult and most of the employees fail, including Fred. The test runs out of time and the only one who seems satisfied with the result is Barney. But when he sees that his best friend hasn't done well, he decides to help him and swaps the envelopes, putting his test in Fred's place. A few minutes later, Sharon shows Cliff the results and he's surprised to see that Fred Flintstone got the best mark. Even though she doesn't believe it, Sharon says he's the perfect choice to put their plan into action. Finally, Cliff goes to talk to the workers and, to everyone's surprise, announces Fred as the company's newest vice president. The news makes him extremely happy and the next day he dresses in his best suit to start his new job. When he arrives at the company, Fred is greeted by Cliff, who introduces him to the beautiful office where he will be working. In addition, Sharon will be his assistant and Fred even gets a phone, a dinosaur to answer and record his calls. All this luxury delights Flintstone, but what he doesn't suspect is that it's all just a setup by Cliff and Sharon. The two of them intend to divert the company's funds into their own private coffers and put the blame on Fred. With everything set up, Sharon suggests that they pass on the transfer documents for Fred to sign, but first, Cliff wants to test the obedience of his new vice president. So, as his first task, He orders Fred to fire none other than his good friend, Barney. When he hears this, he refuses, but Cliff tells him that, because of his bad test results, Barney is useless in the company. Fred continues to refuse, but Cliff gives him an ultimatum, saying that if he doesn't, he'll be sent away too. As expected, Flintstone doesn't know how to break the news to his friend, and things only get worse when he gets home and finds a party in his honor. All his friends and family are gathered to celebrate Fred's new position, with everything being organized by Barney and Betty. Finally, the couple have bought Flintstone a special present, which only makes him even more uncomfortable. Fred refuses their gift and is forced to tell them that, from now on, Barney no longer works for the Slate Rock and Gravel Company. Despite this news, Barney doesn't blame his friend, but questions why he was fired. Fred reveals that this happened because of his grade in the aptitude exam, which was the worst in the class. Fred doesn't suspect that he had changed the exams before they were handed in, but for the sake of his friend's career, Barney decides to keep it a secret. The next day, things only get worse when Betty goes shopping with Wilma and Bam Bam is startled to see a woman wearing a fur coat. The boy sets out to attack her with his club, but ends up destroying several crystals in the store. Betty tries to pay for the damage, but her credit card has been canceled and her savings are almost gone. Wilma doesn't mind paying for the damage to the store, but Betty fears that when the adoption center finds out they're bankrupt, they'll take Bam Bam away. Meanwhile, Fred attends a meeting with the company's executives, where Cliff presents his new project. He intends to create disposable homes for the residents of Bedrock, reducing costs and quadrupling the company's profits. Fred, however, doesn't like the idea and, as the meeting draws to a close, he begins to put together proposals for benefits for the workers, such as salary increases and vacations. Shortly afterwards, Sharon takes the transfer documents for Fred to sign, but he says he's going to read them carefully first. Seeing that he might discover the whole farce, Sharon tries to win him over, but does so just as Wilma and Pebbles arrive at the office. Fred tries to disguise it and sends Sharon away, but Wilma is more concerned about Barney and Betty, who are in serious financial trouble. She says that they have had to rent the house and so she has invited them to live in her house temporarily. Fred supports the decision and the four of them decide to have a barbecue with the new guests. Everything seems to be going well, but on another day at work, Fred misses his old job. Bored, he tries to play with the catapult on Cliff's model, but ends up throwing a rock and breaking everything. Sharon then appears in the room and Fred tries to disguise it, but he asks why an intelligent young woman like her doesn't have a better position in the company. She frowns and thanks him for noticing her potential, and not just her looks, like everyone else. Sharon takes advantage of the conversation and apologizes for having left a bad impression in front of Fred's wife. But he tells her not to worry, because Wilma knows how much he loves her, which gives Sharon a very different impression of Fred. After the conversation, she goes to Cliff's office and tries to convince him to give up on the plan in order to spare Fred. However, the vice president is determined to get the company's fortune and to ensure this, he decides to give Fred one more treat to sign the documents. Cliff then gives Fred a cash bonus, which he accepts without question. With this sum of money, he goes into town and trades in his old stone car for a turbo convertible. Along with this, he invites Wilma shopping and, as well as spending the money on fashionable clothes, Fred buys a new dinosaur grinder for the sink. Unfortunately, all this luxury is not shared by Barney, who has been alternating between jobs to support the family. He tries work at a gas station and as a test pilot, but neither job works out. Meanwhile, the Flintstones enjoy their evening with drinks and their new hot tub, but Wilma suspects something is wrong. She suspects that Fred's promotion was too quick, but he doesn't care and just wants to enjoy life to the full. The two of them then continue their evening of fun, without noticing that, inside the house, Betty and Barney are unhappy that their friends are ignoring them. Another day passes and Fred is getting ready to finish his shift and take Wilma to a luxurious restaurant. He's already on his way out, but Cliff enters the room and asks Flintstone to sign more documents, saying that it's the vacation he'd asked the employees for. Fred is pleased to see that one of his ideas has been accepted by his boss and, without hesitation, begins to sign everything. However, his phone warns him that he should take a look at the documents, but Fred is in a hurry and signs everything without hesitation. Hours later, he and Wilma arrive at the restaurant and take to the dance floor. The couple enjoy all the excitement, while Betty stays at the table, watching everything and waiting for her husband to arrive. When the show is over, the three of them gather around the table and order another bottle of champagne. But to everyone's surprise, Barney turns up as the restaurant's new butler and, seeing Fred squandering his fortune, he angrily leaves the table and goes to take their orders. Even though he sees his friend upset, Fred is so carried away with his life of luxury that he doesn't even bother to talk to him. Things only get worse when Barney sees a news report on TV showing that there have been mass layoffs at the Slate Rock and Gravel Company, all authorized by Fred. Furious, Barney goes to confront him, but Flintstone denies it and says that he only gave the employees vacations when he signed the documents. The problem is that because he didn't read everything, he actually signed the dismissals of all the employees. Wilma asks Fred if this is true and he tries to defend himself, telling his wife to believe him and not Barney, who is just a restaurant waiter. He also claims that his friend is jealous of his success and is therefore making false accusations. This arrogant speech becomes the last straw for Barney, who reveals that he changed the aptitude tests and that this is the only reason Fred was appointed vice president. The argument becomes increasingly heated and now Wilma and Betty also enter the fray to defend their husbands. Finally, the two couples break off their friendship of years and Barney, fed up with the whole situation, punches Fred in the face and resigns from the restaurant. He and Betty return home, collect their things and decide to move elsewhere. Shortly afterwards, Wilma comes home and tries to convince them to stay and make up, but Fred won't budge and Barney does the same. So he, Betty and Bam Bam drive off in search of a new home. Afterwards, Wilma tells her husband that his professional success has caused him to lose his two best friends. However, Fred remains firm in his decision, saying that they don't need the rebels' friendship, as they have everything they need. Wilma disagrees and says that Barney and Betty are more important than all the luxurious life they're living now. To prove it, she starts destroying all the expensive furniture and crockery she's bought, because none of it matters anymore. Fred, however, continues to play the tough guy, so Wilma takes a drastic decision. She picks up Pebbles and Dino and takes them away in a cab to her mother's house, leaving Fred completely alone. The next morning, Barney, Betty and Bam Bam try to survive in a makeshift camp. However, Barney doesn't even know how to light a fire and Betty has no idea how to clean an outdoor house. Even so, the family gathers, happy to be together, but they are soon startled to come across a female Brachiosaurus. She's come to collect the egg that Betty took for dinner and, with no other choice, she returns it to her dinosaur mother. Things are tough for the Rubble family, but they're even worse at the Slate Rock and Gravel Company. When Fred arrives on the scene, he finds himself surrounded by former employees who blame him for their dismissals. Annoyed, Fred went to the office to check the documents he had signed and finally discovered Cliff's evil plan. Fred saw that the documents were authorizations to transfer the company's money to shell companies belonging to Cliff. Fred then confronts the vice president and promises that he will denounce him, but as all the signatures are in his name, he has become the main suspect. Sharon, who no longer wishes to be part of Cliff's plans, asks Fred to flee, as there is nothing he can do now. Soon, news of the company's corruption scheme becomes public and Fred is now a fugitive from the law. He decides to disguise himself and goes to a homeless shelter in search of help. However, his cover is soon blown and all the workers he fired by accident are there. Fred tries to explain himself, but none of them want to hear his excuses and start chasing him. Back at the Slate Rock and Gravel Company, Cliff takes all the money from the safe and prepares to flee. However, Sharon realizes that he only bought a plane ticket and that the whole scheme didn't involve taking her along. Meanwhile, Wilma is at her mother's house and watching the news makes her even more worried about Fred. Shortly afterwards, Betty, together with Bam Bam, shows up to see her and, despite the fight they had, she is willing to help her best friend. To do this, the two need to help Fred prove his innocence, so they go to the company's office in search of proof. When they arrive at Fred's office, Wilma asks for the phone's help to tell the whole truth, but when he refuses, Betty forces him to help them. With the phone, the two run out of the office, but Cliff observes everything through the window and sets off after them. At the same time, on the streets of Bedrock, Fred runs from the angry workers who want to finish him off. Finally, he is captured, but suddenly Barney appears, now working as an ice cream man. He tries to explain to the workers that everything happened because he switched the aptitude tests, but this only makes them consider him guilty and now he and Fred will be eliminated. The two friends reunite in an unpleasant situation, but even so, Fred apologizes for everything that happened. He recognizes that he failed his best friend and so Barney accepts and the two reconcile with a hug. Despite this moving scene, the persecutors still intend to punish them for losing their jobs. Luckily, Wilma and Betty arrive by car at the last minute and drive the crowd away. They then introduce the phone and ask it to prove that Fred is innocent. The bird accepts, as long as Flintstone apologizes for having treated it like a mere piece of furniture. Fred's stubbornness leads him to refuse the request, but seeing that he has made a mistake with the phone, he finally apologizes for not listening to him. The bird accepts his apology and then gathers everyone together to tell them about Cliff's evil plans. With this point resolved, the friends return home, only to find the place completely overturned. Worst of all, Pebbles and Bam Bam have been captured by Cliff, who has left a message warning them that if they want to see their children, they'll have to take the phone to the quarry. With no alternative, Fred obeys orders and, the next day, he and Barney arrive at the quarry, where Cliff is waiting for them. The two of them demand to know where their children are, and the villain reveals that they are tied up on top of the stone-crushing machine. To spare them, Fred gives Cliff the phone, but after catching the bird, the villain activates the machine and the kids are pulled into the crusher. Barney and Fred run to deactivate it, but the pressure is too great and they end up breaking the lever. Barney sees the catapult that throws the stones into the machine and decides to launch himself towards the children. However, due to his light weight, the catapult throws him further into the mountains. Even so, Barney doesn't give up and runs to catch up with Pebbles and Bam Bam. At this point, the boy finally calls him Dad, and this makes Barney so excited that he gets distracted and is hit on the head by a gear. The youngsters continue to be pulled into the crusher and Fred tries to think of a way to save them. Meanwhile, Cliff runs off with the phone, but the animal manages to escape and runs towards Fred. Cliff chases him and, when he finds Fred, he aims his rock shooting gun to eliminate him. Fred has nowhere to run and thinks this will be the end of him, until Cliff receives a surprise blow from Sharon, who decides not to be part of his schemes anymore. With the villain out of the way, all that's left is to save Barney and the children. Fred then remembers when he broke Cliff's model by accidentally throwing a rock and decides to aim the giant catapult at the crushing machine. He uses all his strength to position the catapult and then fires a huge rock at it. At the same moment, Barney wakes up from the blow to the head and pulls the children out of the machine, which is completely destroyed. Finally, everyone is out of danger, but Cliff is still on the loose. He tries to escape once more, but Fred, using his bowling skills, throws a stone in the shape of a sphere, which hits the man's foot and knocks him to the ground. Even so, Cliff tries to escape again, but the crushing machine starts dumping a wave of gravel, which falls on top of the villain. After all the confusion, the police arrive on the scene and, with the truth revealed, Fred is finally cleared. However, he has no idea how he is going to explain the destruction of the company to his boss, Mr. Slate, who arrives on the scene shortly afterwards. But instead of firing him, Mr. Slate brings in a statue in the shape of Cliff, believing that Fred made it out of gravel, without knowing that it is the real Cliff. Seeing that creating statues could be a new field for his company, he offers Fred a promotion, appointing him as the company's new president. Fred is happy about this, but soon changes his mind, as he just wants his job back, together with Barney. Instead of the executive position, he asks for all the employees to be hired, as well as being given a few more essential labor rights. Mr. Slate accepts the terms and Fred and Barney resume their lives and their old friendship. Finally, everyone returns from another session at the movies, with a huge snack to eat at home. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below.